All right, take it away.
All right, thanks, Sydney. Well, welcome everybody to the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group Shoreline Public Access webinar. We do want to let everyone know that we are recording a presentation, but if someone wants to ask a question and doesn't want it recorded, please indicate that in the chat or message Sydney directly to request that we pause the recording. So I'm Rebecca Rothwell. I'm a shoreline planner with the Department of Ecology. I've been at Ecology since 2008, and my co-host Sydney joined the Washington Sea Grant in 2023. She is the Coastal Management Specialist. And in case you're not familiar, we're going to tell you a little bit about the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group. It's a collaborative project of the Washington Sea Grant and the Washington Department of Ecology. We're an educational group of coastal planners working for federal, state, local, and tribal governments, nonprofits, conservation districts, and private consultants. We represent a multidisciplinary group of individuals. Now I'm going to pass the presentation to Sydney.
Thanks, Rebecca. If you're joining today and you are interested in receiving AICP credits, just know that we are offering those. 2 credits are available, and in the follow-up email that you all will receive afterwards, there will be more details about how to get those. So keep that in mind if that's something that would be of use to you. And also, before we go any further, next slide, please. I do want to share that this event is guided by the Washington Sea Grant Engagement Code of Conduct. If you'd like to learn more about what the Code of Conduct entails, we do have a QR code on the screen, as well as it's on the Washington Sea Grant website. Feel free to message me if you have any questions about our Code of Conduct, or if there's anything in this meeting that does make you uncomfortable, please do not hesitate to reach out. And I just ask that everyone here today leave space for others to ask their questions. We are expecting a big group today, and we'll be hearing from multiple presenters. So I'm sure everyone will be perfectly respectful and contribute to a great discussion so that we can all learn more about shoreline public access today. And with that, we will go ahead and dive in. I see lots of folks in the chat warming it up already. So please continue to add your questions to the chat. After we have 2 blocks of presentations today, there will be a Q&A after each, as well as a short break between the 2. As Rebecca mentioned, we will record both the presentation and the Q&A portions to be shared on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website following today's event. And if you do want to verbally ask a question or want to have it asked privately, feel free to message me and I can either make sure that it gets read anonymously, or if you want to verbally ask it, we can pause the recording. With that, Rebecca, I think we can go ahead and switch over to our first presenter, Robin. So Robin, go ahead and get your screen shared. I'll get you spotlighted, and feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Hello everyone. My name is Robin Norman. I go by she, her, and I am the Shoreline Public Access Specialist, formerly the 2024, 2026 NOAA Coastal Management Fellow at the Washington Department of Ecology. And today I will be sharing information about some context, project highlights, as well as next steps for shoreline public access projects that I've been working on as a fellow and now as a specialist. So before I get into my presentation, I just wanted to share that the Washington Department of Ecology mission is to protect, preserve, and enhance Washington's environment for current and future generations. And with our innovative partnerships, protecting and sustaining healthy land, air, and water in harmony with a strong economy, I feel like this is really just a perfect introduction into what to expect today and the core of these shoreline public access projects as we plan for both the longevity and resilience of these shoreline spaces. So what can you expect today? First, I will be giving you a very quick definition of shoreline public access, and then jump into all things Shoreline Management Act, shoreline master programs, as well as rulemaking, and how shoreline public access functions in Washington based on these topics. I lastly will then be sharing some products and takeaways from the 2-year NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship, that I was in at Department of Ecology and next steps for the information I present today. I just really want to preference and acknowledge that this presentation is kind of a high-level overview of both the SMA and SMPs at Washington Department of Ecology. And so if you have any questions very specific to, your local government and their SMP or even permitting, I recommend contacting your regional shoreline planner, or you can contact me, and I'll triage you that way. So jumping right into it, what is shoreline public access? So the state broadly defines shoreline public access as the ability of the general public to reach, touch, and enjoy the water's edge, to travel on the waters of the state, and to view the water and shorelines from adjacent locations. So in practice, this can look like shoreline parks, maybe a boat or a kayak launch, viewpoints, boardwalks, and much more. Later on, I'll be giving some additional examples based on Shoreline Master Program guidance. But I want to be clear that depending on where you live and your experience, you may think of shoreline public access as just marine or Puget Sound, Pacific Ocean, or maybe just lakes and rivers. But per the Shoreline Management Act, which I'll get into, the SMA applies to marine waters, streams and lakes, rivers, for example, upland areas, also called shorelands that extend 200 feet landward from the edge of some of these waters, wetlands, river deltas, and some are all of the 100-year floodplain, including all wetlands. So a lot of variety and diversity, not only in the habitats provided, a part of the SMA, but also in the shoreline public access that you can achieve. So next, I'll be sharing with you about how public access is defined, and what it looks like according to the SMA, SMPs, and how shoreline public access interacts with current rulemaking processes that are happening at ecology today. So in Washington, the Shoreline Management Act, as I've said a few times now, is a cornerstone environmental law. So adopted by voters in 1972 in response to a variety of concerns about uncoordinated development and impacts to the state's shorelines. The goals of the SMA are to protect the environment and public health, plan for shoreline uses, and promote public access. The SMA says that shoreline public access is the public's opportunity to enjoy the physical and aesthetic qualities of natural shorelines of the state and shall be preserved to the greatest extent feasible. So, as much as possible, shorelines should be reserved for water-oriented uses, and those are going to be uses that are water dependent, water related, or for water enjoyment. These uses are designed to increase public access to publicly owned shoreline and expand recreational opportunities in addition to preserving and protecting shoreline resources and benefits. The Shoreline Management Act is also the basis for how shorelines along lakes, rivers, the Puget Sound, Pacific Coast are managed. It establishes a partnership between state and local governments to manage shorelines. And so if you're working in a water-dependent industry, if you visit shorelines for recreation or cultural values, or if you live along the shoreline or own waterfront property, the Shoreline Management Act is going to be the law that guides community planning and regulates development related to these activities. So how is the SMA implemented in Washington State? The SMA is implemented through Shoreline Master Programs, or SMPs. And SMPs are local land use policies and regulations that guide the use of Washington shorelines. So SMPs apply to both public and private uses for Washington's more than 28,000 miles of lake, stream, and marine shorelines. They also protect natural resources for future generations, provide public access to public waters and shores, and plan for water-dependent uses. At Ecology, we will review and approve these SMPs for local governments and provide guidance and technical assistance to help governments develop their own SMP. We work with local governments to create and update each of these unique documents to ensure they comply with the State Management Act, the State Shoreline Management Act, and State Shoreline Master Program guidelines. So state law sets a legislative schedule for when each jurisdiction must complete its periodic review, which is currently around every 8 years. This is a lot of text and a lot of information, but it essentially goes over in an SMP, where should public access be required? Now, in Washington, public access is not required on every inch of shoreline, and the SMA and the SMP do not require local governments to provide access to all shoreline for the general public, including on private property. So, for example, an individual single family residence is not required necessarily to provide public access. However, larger residential subdivisions with more than 4 parcels, or in some instances, commercial and industrial development, may be required to have a public access component. Now, shoreline public access is typically required in areas that increase or create demand, large developments that are water related. The development is maybe on a public land or is proposed by a public entity. And if existing access is being blocked, or if there are conflicts, that may be more relevant to the public trust doctrine as well. We also do acknowledge that in some cases, public access can actually be hazardous or have safety issues, cause significant environmental impacts, contain unavoidable conflicts, and cannot be mitigated, or even have security requirements that cannot be satisfied. So public access, unfortunately, is not always feasible in those instances. But when considering reasons not to have public access at a particular location, we really encourage local governments to consider alternate methods of providing physical public access. This might be view platforms, offsite public access improvements, restricted hours for public access, maybe, or the separation of uses through a site design or plan. So further, SMPs will contain a shoreline inventory and characterization report. These typically contain a scientific baseline for understanding a jurisdiction's shoreline and watershed, guiding policies, regulations, and restoration efforts by documenting shoreline attributes, ecosystem processes, maybe shoreline condition, and really sets a baseline for also measuring no net loss of shoreline ecological functions. This inventory and report should also include public access components. So one example of this is going to be identifying existing physical and visual access. So physical access is probably the most common and most thought of type of public access that we see. This can be anything from trails to docks, piers, bridges, street ends, boat ramps, perhaps. And these locations really help facilitate touching and reaching the water's edge. Visual access, on the other hand, can be a component of a physical access space, or can be solely the type of access that is available. For example, this can be viewpoints, breezeways, roadside pullouts, where you cannot potentially physically touch the shoreline. Another example that I also like to include and point out is cultural access. So a shoreline public access location can have either cultural components like interpretive signage or even educational resources, or have cultural importance like keeping traditional ecological practices and things like subsistence harvesting possible. Local government should also identify their public right-of-ways and utility corridors. So for example, public access can also come in the form of road ends. Now in the state of Washington, public access is a preferred use for a road that abuts a body of water, excuse me. The SMP guidebook describes road ends as typically narrow rights of way that are owned and managed by local governments. So this means that in some cases, road ends are easements across private property that also provide public access. These narrow rights of way and easements extend down to the tidelands, down to the water, and typically users or visitors should be aware and respect that most tidelands on either side of these road ends are going to be privately owned. So since road ends are small and narrow sites that are surrounded by private residential properties, users should really conduct their activities respectful of these constraints, just inherent to the setting and the small space that is provided. Lastly, as part of this characterization report, SMP should also identify areas for enhancing public access. And there's a couple ways to go about this. Jurisdictions can get enhancement ideas through public participation activities that are required for all amendments. And so public meetings after effective notice, allow for the community to have open dialogue and discussion, and ensure that the public knows when to comment on the scope of review or propose changes when it comes to amending the SMP. Other enhancement opportunities, of course, include public properties that are already a recreational hotspot or even have overlap between historical designation, maybe shoreline restoration opportunities or coastal hazard resiliency. Maybe there's already existing informal trails, undeveloped parcels, state-owned agency land, property with potential to become an easement, and the list just kind of goes on and on about private properties with facilities that could promote public access and with maybe a few rules. Um, for example, time of opening, time of visitation, fees, they could be available to the rest of the general public as well. So SMPs can also cover a variety of other topics, like design standards for things like connections to public right-of-ways and view protection. Typically, the design standards are specific enough to facilitate project review with predictable results, but are flexible enough to take into account different site challenges and conditions. You should also be able to find information on different legal mechanisms for permanently establishing shoreline access, for example, an easement dedicated specifically for this purpose, as well as guidelines for conflicts that may arise when establishing public access. This could be things like view obstruction and protection, commercial and industrial sites, blocking or interfering with intended uses, as well as the interaction of critical areas and habitats of ecological importance. So over time, of course, how shoreline public access is described and implemented through SMPs is going to change. For example, triggered through House Bill 1181, passed in 2023, ecology is required to update the SMA rules to describe how local governments need to plan for impacts of sea level rise and increased storm severity to their shoreline. Further, we're also using this opportunity to update the rules to address what we have learned over the past 20 years of shoreline management. This is really important because ecology's rules establish the requirements for what SMPs must include. So by updating the rules, we are changing the requirements for local shoreline master programs. Since SMPs plan for and regulate development, they are important policy and regulatory tools for adapting to climate change. The new requirements will now include identifying vulnerable shoreline areas, including public access, as well as outlining and guiding the types of sea level rise focused provisions SMPs will need to include. Ecology will hold a public comment period on these proposed rules from September 2nd through November 17th, as well as 6 public hearings during this comment period. So as part of this rulemaking update, minor language updates are being proposed to encourage the following things related to shoreline public access. The first being maintenance and updates to shoreline public access plans should ensure that these updates remain current and relevant, that planning processes should encourage equitable access, including prioritizing the creation of new public access for overburdened communities and vulnerable populations. Public access provided as a requirement for development or as part of a subdivision shall remain available for as long as that subdivision or development is alive, and this includes signage and parking as well. Lastly, public access is also needing to be considered when planning for sea level rise and coastal storms. And in the next few slides, I'll just talk a little bit about why that one is so important. So sea level rise and coastal storms can create a shoreline public access location that is essentially unusable or unsafe, resulting in consequences for the larger community and local government. Shoreline public access spaces are where culture, stewardship, and healthy living take place, and are often the only opportunity many people have to access water-related recreational opportunities. Continual or even a singular coastal storm or inundation event can erode or submerge the very shoreline visitors are trying to use and access. Facilities and amenities like boardwalks, parking, restroom, boat launches, and associated facilities like picnicking or boating can experience damage and become unusable and ultimately not serve their intended purpose. So the combination of all of these symptoms results in three things that um, three different buckets, I should say. The first one being a reduction in the actual available land and shoreline that you're trying to visit, reduction in the recreational opportunities and activities that can take place in this area, and then further displace or reduce the facilities or amenities that make any of this possible. So when shoreline public access is reduced in these capacities, the community, cultural identity, social and economic value and benefits that take place at these locations can experience major losses and have cascading effects for the communities in these areas. So, to address some of these topics regarding either updated shoreline public access information, the integration of coastal hazards like sea level rise into all of this, I've spent the last 2 years as a NOAA Coastal Management Fellow working on shoreline public access related projects. So, established in 1996, the NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship provides on-the-job training and education in coastal resource management and policy for students and provides assistance to state coastal zone management programs. Up to 9 fellows are placed with state programs every year, and the program matches students to projects proposed by each of these programs and are selected by NOAA. So as the 2024-2026 fellow, I worked on important shoreline public access projects with connections to equity and environmental justice and climate change impacts and resilience. So the first goal of my fellowship was to increase the use of existing shoreline public access facilities, primarily by providing Washington's visitors and residents with easily accessible and up-to-date information on shoreline public access locations. Therefore, my task was originally to update Washington's marine shoreline public access inventory that has providing this exact service since 2010. Now, as I mentioned, thankfully, Washington Department of Ecology has already laid the groundwork to make this possible. Available on the Coastal Atlas and in the Washington Geospatial Data Portal, you can find an extensive geospatial data set with over 1,000 marine shoreline public access locations spanning across 14 coastal counties. Now, this data was largely collected from 2008 to 2010, but it contains diverse photographs and documents the availability, facilities, activities, um, amenities, and more of all of these public access locations. And so the image on the right that you see there is going to be an example of what you find on the Washington Coastal Atlas. And the example on the right is a beach that you can find clicking on any of these points. So for example, in this data set, you will be able to find information pertaining to the activities allowed at each location, things like amenities, parking, notes on how you can access the waters. This is not only a planning tool, but also, if you were interested, just as a member of the general public and getting outside, you could use this as well. And so, I'm not asking you to memorize all of the attributes that you see on the left there. I just wanted to give you an idea and give an example of how expansive and comprehensive this existing data set already is. However, there has not been an update or an addition of new locations to this data set since it was created. Further, I think without an update, we're really unable to evaluate how or if shoreline public access is changing on this scale using this data. Therefore, there are a few things that we needed to consider before jumping into altering this map. First, we needed to understand how data collected in 2008 to 2010 stands the test of time using ground truthing and physically visiting a subsample of these shoreline public access locations across multiple counties. Next, we needed to consider the spatial boundaries of this data as it only included 14 of the 15 coastal counties in Washington. And further, as we previously discussed, estimating water bodies and the water bodies that SMPs must consider are not only marine, but also include freshwater locations like streams, lakes, and rivers. And so we knew that with upcoming sea level rise rulemaking and trying to update this data set in a comprehensive way, we needed to include more information about freshwater data, as well as information that would inform exposure and vulnerability assessments going forward. So we also needed to decide on what new information could be collected to help with this effort. So to address some of these concerns, I conducted 3 rounds of data collection to add new attributes focused on hazard planning, the removal of defunct locations, and the addition of new marine locations. I also began to expand the data set to include freshwater, as we just talked about, without completely reinventing the wheel of what's available today, and then also including all 15 coastal counties, including Wahkiakum. So first, I visited and collected geospatial data using Survey 123 from a subsample of already existing locations in the data set. On the left, you see an example of the survey page. And I did this to really understand how accurate the data was from 2008 to 2010, and if it held up to 2026. I also used this data set as a vehicle to add new locations to an updated version, or the survey. I concluded, actually pretty excitingly, that the majority of locations from 2008 to 2010 had the same amenities, had the same facilities, had the same general usage. However, the quality and maintenance of these locations, especially ones that are faced with coastal hazards, really varied. That being said, my survey asked the same questions or covered the same attributes as the old data regarding things like setting, amenities, facilities, usage, and also included a few new asks, especially for photographs or evidence of coastal hazards at each location, among other things. The second round of data collection I conducted was through using already existing publicly available data from other state agencies and organizations, and those I have listed for you at the bottom of the slide. And these were primarily used to fill in spatial and temporal gaps, including new point locations, more facilities, more amenities, ADA accessibility, and more. And so this allowed me to really understand the wealth of data that is now available, at least from 2010 onward, and prevent me from reinventing the wheel. And so what I mean by that is that if you are familiar with Washington's rivers and lakes, you will see that in the next coming maps, that not all freshwater access points are represented, and honestly probably have the largest gap in this update and will require, more research and time to really encompass all of the freshwater access in the coastal counties. I think this really stems from the amount of freshwater access and information that the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has on these locations. Therefore, to prevent us from, again, reinventing the wheel, we primarily focused on city or county-owned freshwater access, knowing that agency data could be used side by side with ours and was already covered for those freshwater locations. Keeping that in mind, the third round of data collection I conducted was a task that honestly took the most time and probably was even longer than expected, was that I reviewed resources from many of our local governments. So I reviewed the Shoreline Master Programs, or SMPs, of 133 jurisdictions within 15 coastal counties, in addition to their publicly available public access related plans and resources. So this was not only to verify data that I had already found, but find additional point locations that I may have missed out on. There was definitely a wide variety of resources, and it was different for every local government. So some jurisdictions had very detailed public access, specific comprehensive or even recreational plans, whilst others, simply just had a list of places to access water on their website. The three examples that I have for you today are from 3 local governments. And, these are just examples, but, I've seen a variety of plain lists with and without links to Google Maps. Geospatially referenced maps, for example, large tables like the one that you see on the right-hand side for the city of Redmond, as well as maps that are probably better to be printed on a very large piece of paper rather than on a computer screen. So this effort, and this is the map I was talking about, resulted in 935 point locations that will be added or updated to the existing data set. So in the map that I have provided, point locations that are from the older data set in 2008 to 2010 are in the lighter color, and then the darker color is the ones that I've added. So you can see that a lot of dark red dots are congregated in the Seattle area of the Puget Sound. And in this area, there were multiple cities that had pretty extensive data, especially on locations for their public access street ends, like I talked about earlier. And I think this ultimately resulted in a more comprehensive inventory of their shoreline public access. So of the 935 points, 777 are completely new to the ecology data set, while 158 are going to be updates to already existing locations. Again, interestingly, 28% of the data I collected were from these road ends. And in general, in my opinion, these locations just seem to be underdocumented. So there's probably quite a lot more out there. So in the map that I have provided for you, the colors now match the collection method um, in which the point originates. So when I look at the breakdown of where these locations were sourced, the majority of these locations come from jurisdictional resources in purple, rather than the spatial analysis or the time I took to go outside and ground truth this information, with the ground truthing being in the red. So this could be in part to how we decided to use that publicly available data and not redo the WDFW, many of the WDFW streams and lakes and river sites. But this may also, many of the locations that are associated with lakes and rivers, come from those jurisdictional resources as well, because that's where we were targeting for those freshwater locations. Lastly, I think this figure also sort of gives a clearer idea of what expanding to freshwater locations can begin to look like, and some of those spatial gaps I talked about earlier. So there were many online resources for lakes and river access that were not from state agencies, thinking about, more narrative documents or things related to fishing. However, verifying this information for shoreline public access planning is really hard unless there are locations we can visit in person and have the personnel to do that, or maybe there's local knowledge that can be tapped into that we're just missing. So before I get into what the merged data and sort of the chaos of what that map looks like, I wanted to revisit that in the updated version, some attributes have been added or redefined depending on what was the deliverable. The things in particular of interest to me is the designation created between the types of signage, whether that's signage designating access or signage even deterring access, as well as between the type of activity that is allowed of motorized and non-motorized boating. Based on my experience of the water, you might need a little bit different facilities for launching a kayak versus, say, a 19-foot fishing boat with you and your buddies. So finally, we have arrived at what is attempting to be a combined data set. We are expecting to have over 1,800 total point locations for marine and freshwater shoreline public access, with about 430 of those being boat access only. So this is going to be tidelands that have no upland access, which plays into the public trust doctrine, or even areas just like marine state parks. In the future, we should be able to answer questions about things like number of signage, parking lots, number of locations that require either parking or access fees is all baked into this data set as well, and we should be able to answer once we have the exact numbers. One thing I also would like to answer in the future, and I think is important for state and federal reporting in general, is trying to figure out how has shoreline public access changed over time. I think this question will take more investigating, as me simply putting a new location on the map does not mean that this is actually a new location over time. So For example, if I add a new location to the data set in 2026 and the data has not been updated since 2010, this does not mean that the park didn't already exist during that window. Maybe it was just missed or under construction or inaccessible during that time. And so, long story short, it's a little bit hard to measure how public access has changed so far. Just because if I add a new location, it doesn't mean it's actually a new park or a new access point to the community who access that that site. So over the past 2 years, I've spent a lot of time staring at the computer, and I would love to just share some takeaways from this project with you today. So to reiterate, step 3 of my data collection processes, this included using local government resources for the over 100 and the 333, sorry, the 133, geez, Shoreline SMPs. And so in doing so, I was able to figure out quickly what types of resources and information make the experience of finding and using shoreline locations easier. And so, for example, very maybe it seems like simple things of just adding addresses, road directions, the types of facilities that are available can go a long way and save the user a ton of time, including whoever is updating this resource next in the next 10 years. And so I think making this information accessible is really the first step to encouraging also sea level rise planning in many of these spaces. Documenting public access can open a lot of doors for public engagement, planning processes, funding opportunities, and allows ecology to support sea level rise planning and tool creation. And I think the biggest part of creating comprehensive resources is also the documentation of these street ends that I've talked about. This type of access includes both physical and visual, and was probably the most notable type of data missing from the resources I considered. And I think just in the nature of not documenting or maybe not even knowing that some of these, street ends exist, I think that local governments are maybe missing out on opportunities to create quality public access in these locations, also the ability to prepare for hazards. And when the location becomes blocked, or maybe it maybe becomes harder to restore and enhance access. And I think in some cases, this does leave the upkeep or maybe the responsibility of this public access site to the community members to decide on a day-to-day basis if access is available, who can access this area, and when. And so the last takeaway I really have for you is that I will talk about signage. So while some locations did not have signage at all, which is a bit of a different problem, SMPs are encouraged to set standards, including what I think is ideal, having words and images for public access signage, so that diverse communities and populations essentially know what's going on. Also, this maybe not super interesting, but just having signage placed in a location that is readable and that can be seen from a distance goes a long way. So for the next steps of this data set, we are currently combing through a lot of the merged information and attributes, and essentially, in some cases, having to go one by one for each of these point locations and making sure the data stays intact. That being said, with our over 1,800 points, we are hoping to have this data set on the Washington Geospatial Portal in September, and then soon after also presented on the Washington Coastal Atlas. And I think excitingly, this is not the end of shoreline public access data creation at Ecology. Through the current SMA rulemaking effort that I talked about earlier, requiring local governments to plan for sea level rise and coastal storms, we're working to prepare guidance, tools, training, and outreach materials aligned with these new requirements. As part of this effort, we are creating a web atlas that will house information that governments must use, including a preliminary analysis dissecting sea level rise exposure at public access sites. So how are we planning to do this, you may ask? And what are we planning to achieve? So we are planning to use this point data set and match it with park boundary information from the RCO Recreation and Trails dashboard, as well as parcels to understand the extent of access on the shoreline and provide parcel scale information on how shoreline public access and habitats in these spaces are impacted by sea level rise and coastal storms. We are also considering how other data like piers, docks, assets, and marinas can also be impacted as well. And ultimately, we are hoping that, with government resources, a local government will be able to identify site-specific attributes in these locations impacted by sea level rise and ultimately improve hazard adaptation ideas to address these specific challenges in these very dynamic spaces. So in summary, I really hope this presentation helps you frame shoreline public access, in whatever capacity you interact with it with. And I also believe that this is also an opportunity, in these spaces for healthy living, stewardship, education, safety, and culture, as well as providing opportunities for equity either in your community, city, or even state. And so my next slide is a thank you slide, but I actually wanted to zoom past that one real fast and talk really fast about another public access opportunity um, and resource that we have. So the Washington Coastal Hazards Resilience Network is co-managed by Washington Sea Grant and the Washington Coastal Zone Management Program, which is housed by the Washington State Department of Ecology. So CHURN is a membership of over 70 coastal hazards and climate change practitioners, from federal to local, state governments, tribes, academic institutions, consulting firms, and so on. The network also maintains a listserv of nearly 300 subscribers, and this network provides support and efforts to address the impacts of coastal hazards and climate change, ultimately by strengthening the resilience of Washington's coastal communities. And what I think is really interesting and really exciting about this is that when we ask ourselves a lot of the questions regarding shoreline public access, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? How is it changing in the state of Washington? Right now, I don't know if we necessarily have the answers to that with the state of the data set. I think once we merge, once we publish, we should be able to get closer to those answers, at least in a numerical way. But I think that this project, which I'll explain, is a really great opportunity to provide narrative or additional information, stories that could provide us information and give us case studies or examples about how public access is changing. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What does it look like in regards to coastal hazards and sea level rise? And so currently, CHURN has a Washington Coastal Hazards Project Mapper. And this is a collection of coastal hazard resilience project case studies. In these case studies, they identify practical approaches to coastal hazards, and there is an ability to learn from others facing similar issues in Washington. And so where I come in is that I am creating a public access section of this coastal hazards mapper that has looked through all of the existing case studies that are in the mapper. It's dissected and summarized some of the public access components of these case studies. And then I've, written a little blurb or a summary of some of the things that you may be able to find within their resources, or if you were to contact the people associated with these case studies. And usually these public access case studies are going to be multi-benefit and multi-purpose and incorporate usually habitat or shoreline restoration, uh, you know, coastal hazard resilience, and cover, a pretty nice geographical spread. So I think having both the qualitative and quantitative perspectives of trying to answer how a shoreline public access changing in Washington will be really nice here in the next coming months as ecology continues to undergo sea level rise rulemaking efforts. So I'm going to go back to my thank you slides. And that is all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for walking through all of that sort of technical and maybe confusing information. And yeah, I hope to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was so wonderful. You're getting lots of applause.
I can't
Heart.
see anything, so
Oh,
thank you.
yeah, there's on Zoom, if a bunch of people press applause at the same time,
Yeah, yeah.
exploding
Beautiful.
hands. So wonderful. A big round of applause to you, Robin. And I also want to acknowledge that some folks have shared a couple resources in the chat. Noah shared a link to the Churn website for folks who aren't familiar with it. Kelly shared a link to a recent Seattle Times article focused on blue spaces and public access. So it's great to see a lot of energy around kind of the question of shoreline public access. I think it's a topic that probably everyone on this call feels passionate about in some way. We did have some questions that came in already in the chat, and folks, please feel free to continue adding your questions. Also, if you would prefer to ask your question verbally, you can raise your hand and I will request, you'll get a notification to be able to unmute yourself if you'd prefer to do it that way. But let's get started. There was a question that I certainly had on my mind, and I think you
Yeah.
started to cover it, but just again, reiterating when and where this information will be available, especially this person, Dan, was asking specifically about the criteria related to signage encouraging or discouraging access. Where can people read a write-up, see the data, and interact with it?
Yeah, yeah. So the Shoreline Public Access Points data set will be in two separate places. And once I stop sharing and have so many tabs open, I can definitely provide the links for those. The first one is going to be the Washington Coastal Atlas. And that um, is, let's see, what's the best way to describe? Um, the Shoreline Public Access Points, and there's also line data sets, are not the only thing that are on the Washington Coastal Atlas. So that is housed by the Washington Department of Ecology and includes data from habitats to parcel information to, it's really a tool for planners and I guess members of the public also. To be able to, thank you, Michelle, to plan for, different planning, different scenarios as well as public access. And so we are currently working internally at Ecology to update some of those data sets. I believe I talked about some other data sets that I find useful. We are definitely allowed to put shoreline, other shoreline public access data on there as well. It's not just ecology data. And then the other place that it will primarily be located and will probably go on there first is the Washington State Geospatial Open Data Portal. Quite a long name, but that is probably the easiest place to download this information. And that's probably where it will be first. So I think that was the first part of the question, but,
Yes, the
and
other
then the signage.
Yeah, the signage question. And also, is there going to be a write-up or just any other associated products that people could use to get more context about it?
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of the signage information that I am familiar with, at least for what we suggest or encourage or recommend, is going to be found in the Shoreline Master Program's handbook, and public access is Chapter 9. Internally at Ecology, and since I have started this fellowship, signage has definitely been a big question and topic for us because I think there are definitely ways besides the example of signage that I provided earlier, which is, kind of the standard that we recommend. I think there are definitely ways to incorporate either local character, uh, relevant, RCWs about, road ends, for example. Um, and so I think there might be other signage resources out there. Um, but yeah, yeah, that's the sign is preventing access. Yeah, so for when it comes to deterring or determining access, for the ones that I ground truth, I do have photo evidence of that. And usually that comes in the form of either like more of a handmade looking sign that says no beach access. Or I've seen, signs that either like look pretty official, but you couldn't necessarily tell if it was the city who put that up or what the situation is there. And that may be more of a compliance issue with shoreline master programs um, and public access, and that may be a form of blocking access as well. But I would have to look more into that, and we've definitely thought about, especially the signage deterring access, those examples that we've seen.
Thank you. I'm gonna scroll up in the chat and ask a couple other
Yeah.
questions that folks had. Earlier we got a question from Barbara Ann who was asking, is a public road end that's at a water body that's governed by an SMP automatically identified as a public access point? Like, is the default assumption of a road end that it is a public access point, that it's not, or is it a gray area?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, my understanding is that that is the preferred use. And so that is definitely difficult when you have some of those things that I mentioned earlier, like safety concerns, um, you know, uh, industry, commercial sort of impeding or taking up space at that street end. And so from my knowledge, is definitely a preferred use. I'm not sure. There may be better, shoreline public access planners, or shoreline planners in the chat that may be able to answer, more definitively about that one. But yeah,
Great. And I saw that
I
Michelle had
think
replied with
Michelle.
some RCWs. Yeah,
Yeah.
Michelle definitely is a very knowledgeable person. And then Corey was
Yes.
asking about it looks like the RCW there is like separate from SMPs but related, but maybe not applying to all local governments. So
Hmm.
I just love to see this conversation in the chat of folks, sharing their resources and sharing what they know. So
Yeah, absolutely.
really appreciate that. A question that I know I had and that Bruce also asked was, in your work, did you speak with tribes or work with tribes about how public access is defined on reservation land or other forms of tribal land? And are those data in this data set? If not, where might folks go to learn more about where that type of access is appropriate or where it's not?
Yeah, yeah. So for um in the data that was created from 2008 to 2010, there is point locations that are inside, tribal reservations, tribal lands. And so a lot of those points have you would have to go into the public access or or sorry, the coastal atlas, click on one of those public access points, and those all have links to the associated either like jurisdictional owner. So it would be to the website held by the tribe. Um, you could probably find information about it there. As part of my project, I, yeah, did not have a chance to talk to, unfortunately anyone from tribes. I think with our, rulemaking effort that we're going to now, there is going to be quite a bit of tribal outreach through that. I personally also did not, out of knowing that I wasn't going to be able to talk to tribes within the 2 years and trying to figure out um, which directions to go to, I did not add any additional points on tribal lands or tribal reservations, knowing that I would definitely need to talk to, someone from that associated tribe. So, yeah, if we're interested in, adding points or discussing what is in that data set, in those areas, I would definitely be open to it. I would love to chat.
That actually is a follow-up question that I specifically had. So uh, I
Yeah.
will use my powers as the moderator to ask a question that I had and that seems relevant, which is this data set, now that you are a Department of Ecology employee,
Mhm.
congratulations,
Thank you.
are you going to continue to maintain the data set? How often is it going to be updated, if at all? And can people suggest updates and additions?
Yeah, yeah, people can absolutely suggest updates and additions. In the past, when there hasn't been a shoreline public access specialist representative. Those inquiries usually get forwarded along to a chain at someone in the GIS group who has the like ownership and control over getting that data published. Definitely for now, while I'm still at ecology, I'll still definitely be the point person, at least for now, along with some of my other colleagues who have, mentored and helped me with this data set. For anyone, yeah, who has additions or questions or anything that I think, they think may be missed. This is definitely not the end for where this data set is going to be used. I talked about some of the rulemaking and the sea level rise, exposure um, projects that we're going to be doing. So there's still definitely ongoing work on this data set. And this is, not the end. We're definitely not just publishing it and letting it go. So yeah, much work ahead for sure.
Great, glad to hear it. And before I forget, I do want to flag that when Robin's data set is publicly available, we will definitely share that out on the Shorelines listserv. So in a moment, I'll drop a link to that. Many of you are probably on it already because you registered for this webinar, but that will be another place where we will announce the publication of that. So I'll drop that link in a second. But in the meantime, we have a few more minutes for Q&A. And we did get a question, kind of a more general clarifying question about public access to SMP water bodies. Another question from Barbara Ann, who had asked, are jurisdictions supposed to offer public access to all of their SMP water bodies? Like, is that the default assumption? And I think you've alluded to this already, Robin. Why might public access not be offered in those cases?
Yeah, yeah. In a lot of S&P water bodies, you often have like associated wetlands, critical habitats, areas where you can't achieve, no ecological or no net ecological loss. And so I think there are a lot of reasons why a jurisdiction might not be able to or can't provide access to a water body. But I think, when we talk about the Shoreline Management Act, and I think, I've often heard it called as like the three-legged stool and shoreline public access and promoting shoreline public access being, one of the key policies. Um, I think there's definitely a push and pull when it comes to where public access can be provided. And if it can't, thinking about what is a not only like a valid or like a reasonable alternative, but an alternative that's going to satisfy the needs, the uses, you know, the experience that the user would have had in an area that, maybe is too sensitive or, has some other safety or hazard issues going on. Um, so yeah.
Thank you. A question from Kelly. Kelly had asked, do you have any plans to roll up some of the data that you have at this point, like to say, the miles of walkable public access available or number of places that have XYZ criteria? Either you or could other people possibly do that?
Yeah, yeah, I would love to get some like summary statistics, just or just some numbers, some like specific numbers, not just, an estimate out there. Um, when it comes to, number of sites that are at a road end are marine, number of locations that are like boat access only, like I was talking about. And I think, for providing a little bit of context, ecology is two different data sets. We have our point data set, which is the one that I've been working on. And then we also have a data set that is a set of lines. And essentially from those lines, you, in theory, could be able to measure, how much shoreline, um, marine shoreline in Washington, is publicly accessible or available, via mileage. And so I'm hoping that with the analysis that we're doing with sea level rise, we are going to be trying to match those points and the lines to essentially the data that is like a larger area. And hopefully we'll be able to get some better, statistics and actually identify where the public access is that isn't just, a point in a parking lot or a point on a shoreline or a trail, and actually be able to get some better, ideas of some of the numbers out there of how much access we have, um, what sort of like uses are there? Is it pedestrian? Is it primarily for boats? Is it a viewpoint? And so, yeah, I'm really hoping to get some of those numbers out there. And I think Kelly and I have talked about that before. I would love to do that. So next steps for sure.
And to that point, if there are folks on the call who think that that would be interesting for their nonprofit or the tribe they work at or the local government they work at, how could maybe suggestions that you have for ways that folks on this call could use the data in ways that you might not have time to, or like how, like other ideas that you've had for folks to use the data beyond your specific project uses?
Yeah, yeah, I think the data could really be used to address some of the, things that I talked about regarding like facilities, and amenities. A lot of local jurisdictions where I went and looked at least their publicly available information. Not all of them had information on if there were bathrooms, if there were picnic tables, um, is there a boat ramp at this location? A lot of them have stuff about boat ramps, which is, great and super important. But some of those other like smaller facilities, thinking like playgrounds, I think this could be a really interesting exercise in if there's gaps in data, that this data set can provide with, the 40, 50 attributes we have, maybe that could be an interesting, route to go down if that data isn't readily available, using the point data as a start to look at some of those facilities, amenities, maybe even activities, um, and seeing if those are still possible, if they need updates, maintenance, that sort of thing. So just filling in the gaps there.
Yeah, hopefully folks are feeling inspired.
Yeah.
I think we'll do one more question, and then if folks have additional questions, Robin, would you be willing to respond in the chat
Yeah.
if there are additional? Okay, great, thank you. Just in the interest of time, let's conclude with a question from Jessica. I think a lot of folks probably are familiar with this issue of whether there are any initiatives to change the laws to allow people to walk from a public access point to a public access point across private tidelands, noting that many of these points can be very small and there might be different types of ownership and access between them. Do you know of any initiatives to change this, or more generally, what should the public, local government planners who might interact with the public, like what should the people know about public access, private tidelands, and the interaction?
Yeah, yeah. So that is really getting into, at least from what I know, the public trust doctrine. And I actually have a slide on that I was hiding. So the public t trust doctrine really goes into these two, different ideas that Jessica was talking about, the ability to, walk across tidelands, or being able to access tidelands if there's no upland access, trespassing, for example. And so I think the public trust doctrine, at least when I first started as a fellow, was honestly very confusing. And I think at ecology, there have been quite a few instances where I think members of the public are finding information on the public trust doctrine, and um, especially in public access disputes. And so while personally I am not familiar with any like specific initiatives, it has come up probably, um, 8 or 9 times since I've been at ecology, where there's probably some dispute, usually over like a road end or a smaller space, and there's issues with, trespassing, private tidelands. And so, yeah, I'm not sure of any initiatives, and I honestly would love to, yeah, dig into that a little bit more. But um, yeah, it's definitely a very complicated issue and involves public trust doctrine, and how SMPs interact with that. So yeah, I can't provide any like, unfortunately can't provide any specifics to that question, but I'm, definitely aware of it, and it's definitely an avenue to dig into.
Great. Thank you. Noting also that other agencies probably get this question as well. And so Um,
Yeah.
feel free to continue that conversation in the chat, but we are right on time actually. So I will first let's give Robin another round of applause. And then we are going to take a 5-minute break. So let's return at 2:10 for our second presenters. And so stretch, take a break, get your coffee, whatever you need to do, and we'll be back in just a few minutes at 2:10 p.m. for our second group of presenters. Thank you, Robin. We'll see everyone in a few minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice little break and are feeling rejuvenated and ready to dive into the second half of our presentation today with a case study example of habitat recovery and community access. I'm excited to have Andy, Mendy, and Chris here, and I will just pass it right over to them. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Sydney. Um, Thanks everyone for showing up today to listen to the talks. And thanks so much to Robin as well for kicking us off. I had a chance to tour this site that we're going to be talking about with Robin. I think it was in 2024. Um, and yeah, so my name's Andy Hokett. I'm going to introduce myself quickly and then I'll pass it over to my co-presenters. I'm a project manager with the Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group. The for folks that don't know, the Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group is one of 12 original regional fisheries enhancement groups, or RFEGs, created by the Washington State Legislature in 1990. There are now 14 RFEGs across Washington State, right, Chris? And the RFEGs were created to be active partners in assisting the state in salmon recovery efforts, supported by community volunteers. They're also tasked with supplementing fish populations, restoring salmon habitat, and developing salmon-related education programs. So I will pass it off to Mendy.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Mendy Harlow. I'm the Executive Director of the Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group, and want to thank you for being here today as well. It's exciting to talk about this project that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And I will go ahead and pass it on to Chris.
All right. Thank you, Andy, Mendy. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Chris Waldwillig. I'm with Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm a restoration coordinator, formerly in our restoration division. And yeah, I get the awesome privilege to work with those 14 regional fishery enhancement groups across the state. I get to dabble in some nearshore restoration work here and there, and I get to work with marine resource committees on the coast. So get to do quite a bit of different things, and just happy to share the successes of this project over the last 15 years. And I'll kick it back to Andy to get us started.
Okay, great. Thanks. So yeah, we're going to chat a little bit about kind of a large restoration effort that's been occurring in the Union River estuary. Yeah, over, I guess, the last 15 years and change. And I'd just like to acknowledge first some of the funders for the work that we're going to be talking about here: Washington State RCO, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA Fisheries, and the important advisors and collaborators to this work: the Skokomish Tribe, Mason County Public Works, Mason PUD 3, and the North Mason School District. And so our project site is known as the Feller Wetlands. It's located in the Union River estuary at the terminus of the Hood Canal in Belfair. This is in Mason County on the edge of the Kitsap Peninsula. This is a large and complex coastal inlet in Hood Canal and one of the 7 largest and most complex in Puget Sound. It's also one of the most highly modified coastal inlets in Hood Canal, with the history of agriculture and diking and growing residential development associated with the town of Belfair and urban sprawl from Kitsap County. Feller wetlands are within the Union River unit, part of Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife South Puget Sound Wildlife Area. The unit contains 548 acres of estuarine habitat, salt marsh and mudflat, freshwater wetlands, and riparian and upland forest. This area is managed to, among other goals, protect and enhance ESA-listed fish habitat, protect and restore native plant communities, and preserve habitat and species diversity for both fish and wildlife resources. So this map depicts the wildlife area in green with the many other parcels in conservation in the Union River estuary. Over 500 acres of estuarine and riparian habitat have been protected in the Lower Hood Canal through conservation efforts coordinated with multiple partners, along with restoration of over 86 acres of estuarine habitat through fill removal or dike breaching projects. So we'll speak about a couple of these projects today and the challenges and successes in incorporating meaningful public access to them. I'm just going to use a disclaimer. I'll be using the words levee and dike interchangeably. Sorry if that bothers anybody, but yeah, it'll happen throughout the presentation. So estuary habitat restoration is a huge focus of Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group's work as an organization. Countless fish and wildlife species utilize this habitat, most notably for us, ESA-listed juvenile summer chum salmon. They rely on the complex, shallow channels found in healthy estuaries because these productive mixing zones mean high availability of nutrients, protection from predators, and safe areas for physiological acclimation. The Union River unit has 3.2 miles of trail along the estuary, and the trail system is heavily used. It's a popular destination for bird watching and hiking. Any birders here may recognize it as the most prolific eBird checklist hotspot in Mason County. And it's also an incredible resource for nature-based education programs like local preschool group Barnacles and Bees. The North Mason School District actively uses the site for hands-on science classes. We see seasonal fluctuations in visitation, due to bird migrations, wildflower blooms, salmon runs, and school seasons and camps. The estuary also happens to be home of the Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group, or HC-SAG's office. This location is known as the Salmon Center, and it's directly adjacent to the trail system. HC-SAG coordinates field trips, habitat restoration, and citizen science projects, and through a long-term partnership with WDFW, HC-SAG and Washington Conservation Corps crews help maintain the trail system and facilities on site. This photo is from our climate resilience internship program a few years ago, a collaboration with DNR's Aquatic Assessment and Monitoring Program. I think I saw Cindy Dono is here today, who was part of that program. Shout out to Cindy. The trail system historically was partially owned by DFW and partially owned by the North Mason School District. But some significant changes have occurred here, particularly in the past decade, that have spurred change in management and public access. So this map is recycled from a 2024 grant application for an elevated boardwalk and parking lot improvements at the Feller Wetlands, which you'll hear more about later in the talk. But the main takeaway here is the depiction of the trail network that has existed here since the 1990s. So the parcels in red here, 130 acres containing our project area, known as the Feller Wetlands. These were identified in the map a few slides ago in green, as now under WDFW ownership. These parcels were surplus from the North Mason School District to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife just 3 years ago in 2023. But some important historical context kind of led up to this action. So I'm going to hand it over to Mendy and then Chris to speak a bit on the history here.
Thanks, Andy. So the area that Andy's been talking about, the Feller Wetlands, lie within the ancestral land of the Skokomish tribe. The Skokomish are one of the 3 bands of Tohono Indians, the original inhabitants of the Hood Canal watershed. So the Tohono used the Hood Canal as the main transportation route for travel, trade, digging clams, and fishing. Dulalip was a documented Tohono winter village community at the mouth of Mission Creek, which is part of the Feller Wetlands and Union River estuary. So a couple named Sam and Mary Feller purchased approximately 600 acres of what is now known as the Feller Wetlands from the Puget Mill Company in 1935, a tract that included the salt marsh area. So beginning in the early 1950s, the Puget Sound Retriever Club leased portions of this property and constructed levees at the north end of the property to create freshwater ponds that were used for hunting dog field trials. Then in 1950, unfortunately and very sadly, Mary Feller was killed in an automobile accident. And following her death, her husband Sam donated 5 acres of land to the North Mason School District to serve as a playground in her memory. This site later became the location of the Mary E. Feller Community Center, which is still up on Highway 3, but it serves a different purpose now. Upon his passing, Sam Feller placed his remaining property in trust for the benefit of the community to be managed by the North Mason School District. And of this land, 73 acres, which included the salt marsh, were designated for recreational purposes. It's a very, very long story, but the gist of it is that the wetlands, thankfully, could not be converted into the ball fields that were originally visualized. And instead, in 1988, the Hood Canal Wetlands Project was established as a collaborative effort between the school district and the community. The project was created to be an ongoing program to provide an interpretive, educational, and recreational experience for the general public, teachers, and students, which ranged in age from kindergarten up and through university aged. From 1992 to 1993, the wetland trail system was designed and then constructed. And the Wetlands Project Center building and classroom, which is now called the Feller Wetlands Nature Center, which is pictured here on this slide, were funded by a grant from the Washington State Legislature in 1992, and then construction was completed in 1995. For many years, the Project Center was a thriving hub of educational activities with an AmeriCorps team that hosted field trips and gave a lot of tours to the public. And unfortunately, the center faced significant operational challenges and uncertainty due to financial struggles in 2014. So this led to the North Mason School District to seek new management for the property and its facilities. Eventually, a partnership was forged between WDFW and HCSEG to take on this role, but we'll cover that a little more extensively later in the presentation. So I will go ahead and pass it on to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Mindy, and thanks again, and hello again, everybody. So I'm going to talk, we're trying to stay in somewhat chronological order and talk about some of the activities that have happened out there and kind of highlight the restoration work and of course highlight the public access that went along with it. And before I start, of course, I want to thank my colleague and one of my mentors, Doris Small, who actually led this effort, and I get to talk about it today. She's hopefully having a wonderful retirement. So this work started in 2010. I was around, just didn't lead this, but this work started in 2010, and probably actually the ideas happened before that even. As well as some of the planning and the grant management associated with it. To restore 32 acres, that's kind of inside of this circle on your screen, of filled estuary that was behind these levees. And this work was made possible with an acquisition of the Johnson Farm back in 2006. Now, the trails that we want to talk about, we will continue to talk a lot about, were kind of on top of these levees, and you can kind of see those in the dashed green lines. Let's see here. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Andy. So, starting in 2010, we kicked off the design phase of this project, introduced it to the public, had several meetings. Talked about the objectives and what we wanted to get out of it. We definitely wanted to hear what the public wanted to get out of this, and very much, again, I wasn't there, but very much what we heard was the trails are very important. We want to retain them in the same location. We don't want them to be slippery. We want them, they're very important, and it's you can go there year round and find folks walking the trails. And of course, it's more in the summer, but all year long, you can find folks on these trails. And it's just a great, relatively flat, actually, it's a very flat area to walk. And people are always out there enjoying these trails. But yes, like I said, trails, keep them in the same spot. That was very important to us. Go ahead, next slide. We kind of moved on to a preferred alternative, more public meetings, and we continued to hear about the trails, and we really focused in on the sideboards for this project of restoring as much salt marsh as we could while retaining as much of the trails as we could. Let's go next slide. So the preferred alternative installed 2 pedestrian crossings of 300 and 100-foot openings in the levee to allow for full tidal inundation at the south end and some like overflow river inundation on the north end. We decided to use a concrete bridge on steel piles for longevity and the roughened walking surface, which avoided some of the slippery decking that folks were worried about. The project also included a lot. I had the number and I don't have it in front of me, but I think almost 100,000 cubic yards of site grading to remove, this had been converted into ag industry, ag field. And so we had to lower that elevation and then establish these tidal channels. Luckily, we were able to actually mimic a lot of the 1884 T sheets, which was great. And then create distributary channels throughout. Lastly, a setback levee was built using the excavated materials, and we were able to put a new access trail or a trail with access points to Roselle Road. So that's kind of this dark purple on the right-hand side of that image. Next slide. I'll let some of the photos do most of the talking here because why not? But I will have some here. This is a June 2001 photo. And hopefully you can kind of see that contiguous trail on top of the dike and straight ditches. The borrow ditch that is located inside of the levee. Can't quite see that as well, but Andy's pointing it out with the arrow there. So this is kind of our existing conditions. And I'd also note that that dike extending to the southeast and down below the Golden Bell Mobile Home Park, which forms the freshwater pond and levee trail that wraps around it. And we'll talk more, Andy will talk more about that soon. Next picture is August 2013. And so big changes here, right? Maybe the first thing that stands out to me is the 300-foot pedestrian bridge at the near the lower portion of the picture. And then of course well, I should back up a little bit. The work started in 2012 and then in the dry season, and then took a little bit of a pause because this area gets very wet and has a high water table, and then came back in September of 2013. So in here, you can see most of the grading is complete to get to the right elevation for intertidal and salt marsh plants. Most of the tidal channels complete. There's also a north pedestrian bridge. It's a little bit harder to see, but it's kind of up in the upper left. And then you can kind of see the tidal channel plugs that are located just above the bridges right now, just keeping the site dry until all the grading and excavation work is done. Okay, next slide. Fast forward 2 months and we have inundation. So project is open. You can see it's a relatively high tide here. The tidal channels in their very sinuous nature are all dug and starting to overflow the banks. The site was not really, the estuary side part of the site was not planted. There's a very rich seed source throughout the lower part of Hood Canal. So every time the high tide comes in, it brings seeds and plant starts from the estuary. It's providing rearing and protection for juvenile Chinook from juvenile fish from predators. And then it also delivers food and prey back out into the estuary as the tide goes back out. Okay, slide 17, getting away from pictures just for a second. We kind of call this success validated, right? In 2013, the project was completed. And what's really cool is this slide shows that the adult returns of summer chum that are monitored by Hood Canal Salmon Enhancement Group every year since 2000. They have an adult fish weir. That's that kind of picture on the left, upper left, that they count and handle and count and pass upstream every summer chum that returns. And you can see just 3 to 4 years after the estuary restoration happened, we had a significant uptick in adult returns, and it correlates very precisely with the increase in estuary productivity. So that was great to see. And then just jumping ahead 12 years, go ahead, Andy. This picture on the left-hand side shows what that restored estuary looks like after 12 years. So, yeah, the vegetation has returned. The trails very active and still present. And actually, I forgot to point out in one of the previous pictures, don't worry about going back. You can actually see people, I think it was on that inundation slide with one of the first high tides that came in. You can see people on the trails. It's like little ants on the trails. But so people are using it right away. Yeah, so trails are still present. I have a little note in here that, my kids were part of a 5K salmon run held by HCSEG just last year. And it's just such a neat place to go and run and explore. And I'm going to segue back to Mendy to talk about kind of the start of the most recent project that just was completed.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So as I'm sure you're all aware now, the trail system here in the Union River Estuary has been a really vital community asset since the early 1990s, really. The north side of the trail system, which was owned by Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Johnson family, was connected to the North Mason School District owned south side via a levee that surrounded the freshwater pond that I described before, that was put in the 1950s by the Puget Sound Retrievers Club. So yeah, Andy's got his cursor over that there. So in 2012, a high tide event damaged a section of that levee that was impounding that freshwater pond. And that's what the yellow circle on the map is. So that was the failed tide gate location. So this location in the levee had a culvert and tide gate installed back in the 1950s, and it connected to the straightened tide channel that you can see here in the aerial photo. The tides in this channel over time eroded all of the fill around the tide gate and corroded the galvanized pipe that was surrounding the tide gate as well. So this damaged section saw temporary bridges and fixes installed over the next few years. We really tried our best to keep the trail open, but ultimately, over time, the breach in the levee grew larger and was no longer passable. And in 2014, we saw ESA listed summer chum salmon observed swimming inside the now saltwater pond, which led to potential fixes to include an estuary habitat restoration element. We couldn't revert back to the freshwater pond because of the use of the new area by ESA listed Hood Canal summer chum. So by 2018, the levee trail was completely compromised and no longer passable, as you can see here in this slide. The disconnection from this particular part of the trail was and still is felt really heavily in the local community. The spot on the trail system has a really incredible view of the very expansive estuary that is the Union River Estuary. And it's, been a great loss to the community to not have this part of the trail open. Next slide, Andy. So for a long time, this is what trail users saw at the southern entrance to that levee after the breach in the trail was made impassable. If they wanted to connect to the trails and trailheads on the north side, they had to travel through a tight pedestrian gate onto Roselle Road, which is a county road. So Roselle Road has no sidewalk and is a blind corner for cars coming from both directions. So it was also, as you can see in the picture on the left, subject to flooding every winter during those high tides and low pressure systems, which was also a symptom of the breach in the levee that we just discussed. So during these floods, the road was impassable to pedestrians and to most vehicles during that period of time. The Golden Bell Mobile Home Park has a septic drain field, which is that grassy area on the right of the picture on the left. And so that, unfortunately, the septic drain field there was also inundated during these periods. So definitely water quality issues as well as recreational and transportation issues associated with this levee breach. So next slide. So Department of Fish and Wildlife and HCSEG went through many years trying to secure funding for the restoration work and the trail reconnection. But this section of trail has ultimately been closed to the public since 2018. And as you can see, there's a lot of comments on the All Trails app about the trail being closed, and many, many newspaper articles that have covered the trail closure and kind of what the solution can be long term. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Andy to talk about how we finally accomplished our goal of funding both the restoration components and the recreation components of this project.
Cool. Thank you. So I just want to emphasize again the importance, of these trails to the local community. Robin spoke, a little bit about the cascading effects of loss of shoreline access. North Mason County has pretty limited trail opportunities, except for the Union River Trail system. The Mason County Trails Plan calculated that the county has a deficiency of 28 miles of regional trails that should be in place to meet the demands of Mason County's growing population. So the improvement and growth of the trail system here at Theller is pretty important on a regional level as well. So the success of the Union River Estuary Restoration Project in 2012 on the adjacent property was pretty informative in shaping the next steps at the Theller wetlands. And you might think, well, why wasn't that restoration project just expanded 500 feet to the south to address the levee breach situation at Theller as well? And the short answer is that these parcels were still under North Mason School District ownership. And as Mendy described, they were facing funding challenges at this time with the properties, no longer supported by the original Theller trust. But in 2014, a preliminary engineering report was produced for the school district, kind of laying out alternatives for addressing the trail breach. And these alternatives range from, culvert or bridge installations at the breach site, partial levee removal, tide gate installations, setback levees, and with movement in subsequent years towards DFW being handed ownership of the Theller wetlands parcels, HCSEG and WDFW began to pursue grant funding to implement a restoration at the site, based on the preferred alternative shown here in the bottom right. And that was this was the concept that we used to obtain, our first few grants from National Coastal Wetlands Conservation Grant Program in 2018, which was, kind of detailed the working agreement for HCSEG and WDFW to design a restoration together at Theller, with WDFW habitat engineers producing that design. And we also pursued grants from RCO, the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program, and Salmon Recovery Funding Board in 2020 and 2022, respectively. But yeah, the concept basically removed both dikes here and constructed a 500-foot setback dike alongside Roselle Road here, and constructed a 425-foot concrete boardwalk just an out and back on the south side, and raised this access road down here just by a few feet in a few locations. But it had some disadvantages to it, namely that the setback levee here alongside Roselle Road would fill 0.75 acres of wetland. The wetland trail originally on top of the levee here would be replaced by this roadside trail, so kind of losing some of that backcountry aesthetic that was important to users of the trail. And yeah, it kind of combined these habitat restoration elements with recreation elements you know, to provide a pretty expensive project. Um, so we set out to design, kind of refine this design that would address these disadvantages. And the challenge became maximizing the ecological footprint, so to speak, of the site, while simultaneously reconnecting the local community with this cherished recreational trail. So we started to explore boardwalk possibilities. And, we conceived that if we could construct an elevated boardwalk in the footprint of the levees we plan to remove, that was the best way we could minimize impacts in reconnecting the trail. Many of you have probably visited the Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge. They built a mile-long boardwalk in the estuary out there that's really incredible. We visited the site in September 2023. We were graciously given a tour by refuge staff with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they took a close look, or we took a close look at the successes they had out there, but also heard from them, speak pretty frankly about issues they were dealing with 12 years out from the boardwalk opening in 2011. And so we learned a lot there that we ultimately incorporated into our current boardwalk design. We also met with, on the habitat restoration side, we met with the Skokomish Natural Resources staff and toured their estuary site. Um, we incorporated lessons we learned from them on designing the shape of our tidal channels um, from Joseph and his staff. This photo is kind of hard to decipher, but that's a drone photo of us all gathered at the site in 2022. And by late in the year in 2023, we had a revised direction for the project. Instead of a trail on top of a new setback levee constructed alongside Roselle Road, the county right of way, we started having discussions with Mason County Public Works about instead elevating the road itself to act as a setback levee. So this meant, no fill in the wetlands along the west side of the road here, which was a lot easier for us to permit. I'm not sure if we would have been able to permit the project if we had, ultimately gone down that road. But the boardwalk, could be used then in this original levee location to provide a trail that's, yeah, much more aesthetically pleasing. And it gives a front seat view of kind of restoration and action that's happening out at the site. We held public meetings also in 2022 and 2023 to kind of introduce these concepts to the general public. We spoke to county commissioners to gain support for raising the road. Talked about our plan to build the boardwalk and reconnect the trail and kind of build trust. We had kind of just worked with Mason County Public Works engineers for a period of time, and who ultimately provided us design drawings for the road element of the project. But we had to go to the commissioners to present on the project and, kind of get full buy-off and make sure everyone understood that, by us asking to elevate, their road, we were also, reconnecting the community with this beloved trail access. So permitting was big for us. We utilized the multi-agency review team, or the MART, who work within existing permitting pathways, but that kind of differs from the conventional process by using this team. They kind of bring federal, state, and local agencies together as a coordinated team to assist applicants through the entire permitting process. And they kind of facilitate navigation through that process and help direct applicants to streamlined permit pathways that might not be known or clear. We used this method and it was very helpful. This photo is from a site visit with the MART in June of 2023. And we also went through the Habitat Recovery Pilot Program, which is a WDFW program that expired in June 2025, but it was just another pathway that streamlined local and state permitting processes that was very helpful to kind of us implementing our project in a timely way. We'd like to see that program reinstated. Chris, I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about permitting.
No, I think you wrapped it up there pretty good, Andy. I mean, the MART was amazing. I mean, I think Diane Hennessy did an amazing job there, bringing everyone together. I think it was monthly check-ins with each agency on where are you, how much longer is it going to be, what else do you need, and then the next month kind of just got us through it really quick. I want to say we had permits in about 5 months, 5 to 6, which is pretty quick for a project that needed as many permits as it did. And then, yeah, the HRPP was great. There was a question I think Robin brought up about, how did ecology review the shoreline access, since we're talking about that today, with this project. And I don't think it actually came up too much because we used the HRPP, but as you all are hearing, it was very important for us and the community to make sure it was in there. So it would have been there had we gone through a more typical process anyway.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to try to scoot ahead so we just have time for questions. But yeah, we by 2024 we had all the funding in hand to implement the restoration portion of the project. In 2024, we were still competing for boardwalk funding that had to come from a separate recreation-focused pot of money from WWRP, which we are now under agreement for. But by 2024, we started to move towards implementing the restoration project, the habitat elements in particular. And as I mentioned, the land transfer happened in 2023. So once the state took ownership of those lands, we were able to work with them to implement this project. Here's kind of like a closer zoomed in version of that parcel transfer and contextualized at the restoration site with the breach in the levee and the proposed boardwalk section and the entire 7-acre estuary restoration right here. So yeah, we moved to implement this and ultimately broke ground in 2025 in July, so just about a year ago. Here is our crew doing the initial defishing at our culvert site and digging the culvert pad in the first few days of construction for the box culvert installation. This is one of our contractors demolishing the north side levee. And we just, these levee soils were, just kind of created in the 50s by, just pulling this borrow ditch up. So these were native soils that we learned, through our geotechnical explorations could just be, scattered back throughout the site. And we didn't have to go off-site to dispose them. Here's our contractor installing the culvert right in the middle of installation, the crane, and excavating the tide channel out of this straightened channel here. We dug a new kind of sinuous meandering tide channel to run through the site. This is the elevating of the county road to act as the setback levee. And ultimate paving here. So now this is the Golden Bell Mobile Home Park that Mendy spoke about earlier, which is now protected from wintertime floods because we had elevated the road an average of about 4 feet. And this is what the restoration site looked like in August of 2025. We had dug our entire pilot channel here and connected it to these distributary channel networks. We hadn't fully connected it to the culvert here yet, but the restoration was nearly complete. And yeah, it was these elements here. So the county road had been raised, culvert had been installed, levees removed, distributary channels connected. And the only thing remaining now is to install the boardwalk, which I will get to here in a few slides.
Hey, Andy, I just want to
Mhm.
do a quick time check. I want to make sure
Oh,
that we leave time for questions.
yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm like pretty close to the end here. But yeah, I can just kind of cruise through. Um, Salt marsh recruitment, it's occurring here. And this is just last spring. And then our next steps here are boardwalk construction, that's funded along with trailhead redevelopment. So folks can see an improved trailhead with access for WDFW. This is coming, probably going to be implemented in the spring, but the boardwalk is under contract and should be getting constructed next month. And yeah, just yeah, sorry, I also want to leave time for questions. So some of our project benefits and key takeaways here. Um, but yeah, I'll just wrap it up there. Thanks everybody. Just go out and visit the site. It's really incredible. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Andy, Mendy, Chris. You're getting the explosion of hands, a huge round of applause from our audience. And folks, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And we've got one already from Jessica, celebrating the great project with all of the benefits that it entails. Jessica's curious if raising of the county road was funded with restoration funding as well, or a different funding source.
Yeah, I could take that one, Andy. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it was a really great project. And yes, I would love to show anybody around anytime. The road was part of the overall project, because the original plan did have a levee adjacent to the road. We essentially didn't really change the design much. We just moved that levee that was going to go next to the road on top of the road. And Mason County provided, I think Andy mentioned Mason County provided the plan set for that construction for their portion of the road.
I think along those lines, something that I was curious about, and others on this call who might be thinking about doing a multi-benefit and public access project is, can you speak to whether the public access component, helped get more money for your project or garner political support, or what are some of the benefits of centering public access in these community needs in restoration projects?
I, I would say it honestly made it a little more challenging because some funding sources really don't want to fund recreational projects. So we had to be very careful about not utilizing salmon recovery dollars for recreation a recreation project. So that's part of why the boardwalk is just now going to construction, because we had to seek different funding to execute that part of the project. So while it's, I believe very important to include access opportunities for people, it does make it a little bit more challenging. And yeah, thank you, Andy, for showing this slide with the different funding sources. Yeah, the WWRP funding is the funding that is going toward the boardwalk construction and the trailhead redevelopment. And so we had to completely separate those elements out of the overall project from the ESRP and Salmon Recovery Funding Board perspective.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We have a follow-up question from Jessica about uh, curious about if the information on the lessons learned on the boardwalk, I think from the Nisqually site visit that you all had the opportunity to do, or just lessons learned from that, or what you've learned as well, that is that documented anywhere for reference for other project practitioners?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that like I think the biggest lesson we learned from Nisqually was that we were considering early on a certain type of foundation. I think they're known as like diamond pier foundations that were they're kind of advertised as highly useful for wetland areas, and I think they are in some cases because they, unlike a traditional piling foundation that has a large footprint, these are like pins that go diagonally through and kind of large steel pins that have a smaller footprint and they're kind of installed in angles. And they've been having issues, I think, with those foundations eroding a bit. And they also had, I think a lot of the original hardware that they installed was not correct. It was either maybe they used galvanized hardware that was like that just corroded pretty quickly that they had to go in and ultimately just like, replace. And so those were two large lessons right there that kind of like steered us away from the diamond pin foundations. But I'm not saying that they're not appropriate for other sites, but we just kind of veered away from that. And thanks to Nisqually um, letting us know.
So to answer the question about whether or not that information is available, documented somewhere,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
does the refuge have that documented in some way?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, it sounds like maybe Andy, Mendy, or Chris, if folks have follow-up questions or need to get connected with that information, now you have three excellent resources of folks that you could reach out to. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, I see that we are approaching the top of the hour, and we just have a couple quick wrap-up things that we want to do and make sure to get you all out of here on time. So let's give another big round of applause to Andy, Mendy, and Chris for this awesome project. And I'm feeling really inspired to get out and visit. I'm a bird watcher, so I'm really curious about the opportunity to go out there and visit. Um, in the last few minutes, I will just go ahead and remove the spotlights from our speakers and we can go ahead and wrap up. All I'll say as we get you out of here on time is everyone who registered, including obviously all of our attendees, will get a follow-up email. We'll be posting the recording of this presentation as well as our presenters' slides to the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website. In that follow-up email, there will also be a survey if you want to share any feedback with us. And also, if you want those AICP credits, the information for getting those will also be in the follow-up survey. And then I just want to point folks to our next upcoming event with the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group. It's an in-person event. Currently, the event is full. We're really excited about the fact that there was all of this interest, but we are maintaining a wait list. There's only 4 people on the wait list. There's probably going to be cancellations. And so if you are curious to visit the Padia Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and learn about the latest in steep slopes research, please send me an email. The information is on the link that I just put in the chat, and we'd love to see you at our next Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group in-person event. And with that, I'll just say that again, you'll get a follow-up email where all of the information from today's webinar will be posted. It'll be also on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website. If you want to hear about future events, make sure you're signed up for the Shoreline's listserv. And I want to say, on behalf of Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters, Robin, Andy, Mendy, and Chris for sharing your information. Thank you to everyone who shared resources and asked questions in the chat. And thank you for coming today. Please reach out to myself or Rebecca if you have any questions. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group event. Thanks, everybody.